Welcome to the House of Jesus. House of Jesus communities are those that are constantly aligning themselves to Jesus, the cornerstone. Accordingly, they preach and teach the words of Jesus, and they walk out his ways. The vision of this video series is to unpack Jesus' culture of godly love and equipping-based empowerment. As we do so, we will detail the biblical foundation for our convictions, as well as provide practical strategies for implementing the Master's ways. But be assured, walking out Jesus' ways is not a decision, but a lifelong calling and process. We are humbled that you are joining us on this quest. The fourth video is entitled The Equipping Value of Clarity and has been recorded in partnership with Drew Stedman, the Church Planting Catalyst. This teaching unpacks the first value of Jesus' culture of equipping-based empowerment, namely compelling clarity. Like his Father, Jesus begins his ministry with twofold clarity, what he desires for both his followers as well as the lost. As we summarize Jesus' ways, listeners will learn that clarity is a value modeled by God. Clarity includes a vision of a preferred future. Vision clarity is best caught via desired outcomes and often combines two distinct tracks. And clarity is best communicated both verbally as well as through written statements and narratives. My prayer is that this resource accelerates your alignment to Jesus' ways. This particular value is really all about beginning with this win in mind, beginning with the destination. This morning I was thinking about how many times I have driven to a place. I've had an address. I thought that was correct. And so I did exactly what I needed to do to arrive at a specific location, only to discover that it was the wrong address. And that is so frustrating, but that's exactly why this is so important. In fact, I would say that this particular value is the most important, because if you get this wrong, if you end up at the wrong address, if you end up at a place that you did not intend to arrive at, then you sort of have to start over. So compelling clarity is specifically thinking about what is the destination and then reverse engineering and figuring out how to get there. And that's exactly how our Father operates. I love this passage from Isaiah 46. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand and I will do all that I please. What I have said, that will I bring about. What I have planned, that will I do. In other words, just about this same address, the Father knows the address he wants to arrive at. He's got the right address, and he is going to work his way, his will, in order to accomplish that. I see that in Revelation, several places, chapter 7, verse 9, but maybe better for me is chapter 21 and the description of the New Jerusalem. That's where he wants his family to join him for eternity. And so that's how I envision this whole concept of compelling clarity is I'm going to get this destination in mind. And once I have that really clear, then I can work my way backwards to figure out how to accomplish that. And Drew, one of the things that has also highlighted for me how the Father sees vision is this verse, Ephesians 2:10, which for a long time I didn't really get or understand. But now I more clearly see that it is describing two parallel visions that the Father has. I call it a dual track or multi-track vision. We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. And what I'm seeing there is really two different tracks. The first track is his equipping. We are God's workmanship. This is the vision track that highlights the readiness of his disciples who are going to serve. And we looked last time at this word, katartismon, which is all about equipping. And so literally, the Father is restoring us, aligning us, training us. And so literally, Drew, he is doing that for you and I. But there is a second track to his vision, and the vision is the good works, which he's prepared in advance. And so that second track highlights the needs of the people that we are uniquely called to serve. And so, Drew, that's a separate. Both of these are distinct and separate. One is sort of the Acts 1 upper room community for Jesus, and Acts 2, the coming of the Spirit. Pentecost is the second of these visions that I think Jesus has. Drew, I'd love for you to, as I've unpacked this dual track vision, what are the challenges that you're seeing in the church as it relates to leadership teams balancing these two elements? What are you seeing?
Yeah, this is such an important topic because it's so easy to become a one-track vision and lose sight of it. And maybe there's a church out there that leans too far in developing their team. I don't know that I've run into them. I think for most of us, it's the demands of ministry. And in your church planting, you literally don't have a church, so you've got to. There's so much work that goes into building a church if God calls you to church plant. But then if you're stepping into an existing church, caring for the congregation, navigating a transition well, like you just add all that up, those are intense. They take a ton of focus and prayer and emotion, and you're working with people and dealing with a congregation, dealing with people that are new to faith, marriages that are in crisis. Like you just go down the list, and it's so easy for that to take up all of your attention because it's so urgent, it's so in front of you. But there's this whole other side of how are we actually developing the people that we're serving with. So it's not just caring for a congregation or planting a church, but it's actually discipling and developing a team of people that will do that together. And that right there, I believe, is the difference between movement, between New Testament ministry and maybe the pitfalls that we seem to fall into so frequently in the Western church. And, if I could go back, you referenced this, Charlie, but if I could go back and look at the life of Jesus, what's always struck me when I've kind of looked at the New Testament with this eye towards church planting and disciple making and what we can learn, the ministry of Jesus always throws you off a little bit because you're like, what was his technique? Did he have one? I mean, it doesn't. I think you can maybe draw some principles, but I've read a lot of books that kind of try to say this is like the definitive disciple making of Jesus or the definitive church planting strategy of the early church. And I don't really find them compelling because I think in the end, I don't know that it's a method. I think instead it's a development, it's a culture. And you look at Jesus, what did he do? He spent 3 years with his team and he poured into them. They did ministry. So it's not that they were just sitting around. But I think you could really look at Jesus's earthly ministry, and one of the primary features was the way that he was intentionally developing his team into the purposes of God. And it was precisely that, that is what you see in the upper room in Acts 1, is this gathered group of people that the 120 that were the disciples were the ones who Jesus had poured into over the course of 3 years. It's precisely that group that was then able to steward what God did at Pentecost. And if it hadn't have been for the 120, there wouldn't have been a Pentecost, or at least there wouldn't have been the church movement that took place. And so I think that's important for us to think is like, yes, we have this vision and these incredible prophetic promises and dreams and whatever it is that God's given your team. And absolutely praise God for that. But I think we have to follow the example of Jesus and recognize for that vision to happen, we need more than just me going around. Like we need a team of us that we're pouring into, developing and growing together, so that we can actually steward what God does in the bigger thing that he's called us to.
Drew, I was thinking about this also this morning that Mary Lou and I no longer have a dual track vision for our family because one of the tracks, our 3 sons have grown up and moved on. And so we're kind of back to just her and I as a part of the vision as we live life together. but you are in the trenches, bro. And I think this relates to you as well, is that you and Bethany are obviously trying to maintain a strong marriage and relationship and everything that that means. But you have four individuals that you are trying to steward, and that's a whole nother ministry of the two of you partnering together. I think balance is hard in that setting as well. I'm sure that's part of the challenge that you guys are experiencing in this season.
I love family metaphors for church because I think that's the best way to understand the church is to think of family. And family, like you just said, Charlie, is typically going to have two-track visions, where that's such a good example where, on the one hand, we have these children that God has given us and all that goes into their development, their provision, their discipleship, just creating a loving and fun atmosphere in the home, all of that, so that takes up so much of our time and attention. And, I'm past the newborn stage. And I'm sure several of you listening are in that stage, and it can be so demanding, and if you're not careful, like that just takes over every aspect of life. But if we can take a step back, I think we all recognize that actually the health of our marriages are critical for what God has called us to. And ultimately, when we have a vision for our marriage, in addition to a vision for our children, and we're not willing to sacrifice one for the sake of the other, it's actually those two connected that bring the most amount of health. And so, maybe in the short run, it's easier to skip the date night or to, whatever the thing is that you need to do to invest in your marriage because you've got so many demands in front of you. But hopefully we all recognize that in the long run, that's a short-sighted way of viewing our calling to be a family. And we need to pursue both of those. So, yeah, I really think that's a great metaphor for what we're talking about here as a church, is to say that God has given us people to serve, but he's also given us a team of people to walk with. And we actually need intentionality in both places for how we're growing together. And when we get it right, that's the power of it. And of course, all of us are in ministry, and I look at over my years of ministry, and there's so many times I did not do this well. So nothing but grace, if you're listening to this, it's so understandable how we fall into that. But I do, because of that, because I recognize that actually has to take up more space in my own mind and intentionality for me. I'm probably going to always be present to the needs of the congregation as long as I'm in ministry. I kind of have to be. So that actually means I need to put a lot more intentionality of making sure I'm focusing on my team, because that's the one I'm most tempted to lose sight of. Just like in parenting, my kids, they're going to scream, they're going to cry. Like, I'm going to need to take care of them. And yeah, the thing I have to be most careful of is that my marriage gets that same intentionality.
Good.
So Charlie, we have this big concept of vision. I want to drill down a little bit, because I think hopefully we're tracking, like, we need a vision. We need to have a vision that's multi-layered or multifaceted. There's a lot of things that go into this, prophetic words, and what does it mean to be a healthy church? But I find for most pastors, maybe in the clouds, we can kind of conceptually get excited about a lot of different things. But I know as we work with churches, and I've seen this with you, is that you encourage church leaders to break down their vision into measurable outcomes, kind of take it from the clouds and put some more specificity to it. Will you take us into your thinking of why that's a big deal and what you hope to see happen?
Yeah, this is another continuation of what we have highlighted, the importance of moving beyond intuitive insights. It's easy to assume that you understand what your leader is vision casting, but I think it's very important to take the time to unpack it. And the way that I suggest individuals unpack it is desired outcomes. Just I have an example of that from a life group, DNA, wins for those who are being served. And you can see here just examples of what you're shooting for. New participants who are genuinely welcomed. People feel safe sharing their stories. People find deep, authentic connections. I just think it's important to define this stuff so that we're all on the same page. And to me, these are good reminders. Drew, how do you see this being helpful, maybe to an existing life group leader, or even something that would help you train others?
This just shows you what you're going for, right? So, if I give a life group leader a list of, what they're supposed to do at a life group, and, you have to bring snacks, you have to facilitate a discussion or something like that. I'm giving you activities, but I'm not clarifying what we're going for. I'm not really giving you a vision at that point. And so the problem with that is, first of all, you do the activity, but you don't know the purpose of it, which if you've ever done that before, it's probably not going to be nearly as good. But then you also can't really innovate ever, because all you've been given is the activity. But when I'm given this, like let's take new participants feeling genuinely welcomed. If I see that that's the outcome we're going for, that really informs the way that I might lead a group. Because then, I'm not just looking at it from, I need to have an icebreaker question, but I'm actually looking at it from, have we created a hospitable environment that people can walk into? And, I've also found where this can be really helpful is it becomes a tool of evaluation. If I'm not clear
Yes.
what the goal is, all I can really evaluate is, did I do the activity? And so, I either did or did not ask the icebreaker question, or I did or did not provide snacks. But when this is clear, a new participant feels genuinely welcomed, then I can actually evaluate, is what I'm doing contributing towards that or not? And so it actually helps me to make adjustments as needed and survey a group. We've all led life groups, and sometimes the things that work with one group don't work with the next group, or you're trying to reach a certain segment of people and their needs are different. So if all you have is an activity, you don't really have any way to contextualize towards a new group of people. So yeah, tools like this I found to be tremendously helpful. And I'll just add one more bonus to it. This isn't maybe a scenario you have here, Charlie, where I'm receiving a list of outcomes. The act of developing outcomes is really powerful as a unifier as well. And it helps, like you mentioned with you and Mary Lou, just getting synced up on language. And I've done this before with teams where we'll kind of list out what the wins are. And it's a fascinating conversation, because you start to see, how we use words is different, or what really matters to one person on the team is different than what matters to somebody else. And those become great topics of discussion to have. And, then if you get a whole team of people aligned with wins, that's where you're really hunting, whether it's life group or any other form of ministry.
Drew, as you already know, it's also important to define the desired outcomes for those who are serving with us, those in the upper room who partner with us to do ministry. And I've got examples of that as well. Apprenticing enables emerging leaders to grow in their confidence and competence. Shared leadership enables group servants to avoid overload and burnout. Feedback enables group leaders to improve their knowledge and skills, et cetera. So it's the same thing. And I think that these are important because it's easy to forget to prioritize the needs of the people that are serving. And I want to be sure that I encourage them, coach them, provide them what they need. It's really the same principle. We don't want to forget the needs of the individuals that we are serving, but we have to think about those who are on our leadership team to be sure that they're getting what they need as well. And therein lies the challenge of balancing those two audiences.
It's great, Charlie. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've looked back, my hope would be, if somebody serves in any capacity, that their testimony at the end would be that they grew. They both grew in their ability, whatever the ministry skill set is, but they also grew in their walk with God. And that doesn't just happen. God's faithful to people, but I've found it's my intentionality to walk with them that really becomes the make or break of that. And I talk to leaders a lot. It's like, if you can get on the positive side of that, where everybody serving with you is always growing, it's just amazing the potential of what that could look like, the number of people we're releasing into God's harvest field. But if we don't do that, if we're always just caring for the life group, you just burn out leaders constantly. And, it's not good for them. It's not good for the group. And ultimately, we miss out on a great commission opportunity to release people. So let's dive into a few takeaways that we want to make sure that we pull from this lesson. First of all, clarity is a value that's modeled by God. And you see that in regard to the scripture. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, all scripture is inspired by God and useful for training and teaching and correction. This whole idea that God is committed to clarity, so much so that he would inspire his words to be written down and preserved through the generations, so that we still have a reliable and authoritative testimony that we can lean on today. And, that so much of ministry is based on that, and God's foreknowledge to provide that for us. But we can even take it deeper and look actually at the incarnation of Jesus. Like, not only did God give us the scripture, but God is so committed to clarity that he actually became one of us.
Yes.
To be God's exact representation.
Yes.
You see John chapter 1, verse 13, like the word of God became flesh. I mean, that's how committed to clarity God is, that he would actually become a person so that we can see him rightly. So moving on, clarity also, it's modeled by God, but it needs to include a vision of a preferred future that in turn catalyzes a plan of action. Like we have to see what's out ahead of us, and it needs to be something that inspires us, that calls us to something. But then it also needs to be able to turn around and lead us to do something, and not just have warm, fuzzy feelings, but actually inspire us to get out of our chair, to take a step, to step into the purposes of God. You see, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 20, Jesus was chosen before the creation of the world, but only revealed in these times. And Charlie, I like your insight from this verse. Why don't you, what has God given you here?
Yeah, the first time that I saw this, I was pretty stunned. I naively thought that Genesis 1 was kind of the beginning of the whole story of God. But this verse highlights that he was thinking much bigger and broader than just Genesis, as he envisioned his New Jerusalem. And what we see here is that as the Father had that clarity in regards to vision, he obviously then realized and knew that there would be a need for a sacrifice. And so Jesus was chosen before the world was ever created. Literally, this is one of the very first things that we see sequentially in the Word of God. And so this just highlights that the Father starts with the end in mind. He knew that this was going to be a necessary step. He chose Jesus even before he created us. So it's just reinforcing that the Father has a preferred future, and his plan of action sprung into place before the creation of the world. The desired outcomes that we've been talking about, I think, are super helpful to unpack this vision clarity. I think one of the challenges is that they are often related to multiple tracks. And so we do need those desired outcomes, but we have to realize that there are multiple audiences that we are working with. And so this is part of what we've been talking about. And I do want to give a little spoiler alert and just help you see where we're going with these desired outcomes, is that not only is this super helpful in defining the visions that we want to accomplish and for us to work on these together as a leadership team, but these desired outcomes are going to be a part of great role descriptions. In other words, whatever role I have in the vision, some of the desired outcomes are going to be things that I specifically focus on. And so as we begin to talk about anointed fit next time, we'll be talking about the ways in which the desired outcomes are broken up into various pieces that individuals own and work to accomplish. So this is going to be kind of an ongoing discussion of how to leverage the vision to create focus for our equipping of other individuals. Lastly, we want to just clarify that clarity is best communicated both verbally and through written statements and narratives. And this kind of, again, is the whole concept of being intentional rather than intuitive. And we could spend a lot of time unpacking all the different ways in which clarity needs to exist for a church plant or an existing congregation. And so we've created a handout that goes with this presentation, and it's worth just glancing at because there are various ways in which we need to break down clarity as it relates to various elements. And I have a slide here that just unpacks some of those ways: vision, contextual assumptions, missions, slogans and statements, relational values. This is just a sampling of what's in the handout. And Drew, I'm kind of curious, based on your work with churches, obviously there are lots of churches that have visions, but sometimes they stop at visions, and even the vision can be much more of a slogan than actually a specific target audience in something that can be measured. But what are the things that you don't see when you look at a church's DNA? What are the things that you wish were written down and explained that you're just not seeing very often?
Most things, I think as a general principle, most churches I work with, I think could use more. And I'm looking at these, and the mission, slogan, and statement, that one probably comes most naturally to pastors. But the further down this page you go, the more gaps you see with these. Like, I don't know how many churches have taken the time to define their contextual assumptions about the community that they're serving and the types of people that are going to be coming to their church and how their vision is going to interact with them. That's a fascinating exercise, and that can even change over time. So it's worth really looking at. Or leadership values is another great one. When somebody leads in your church, what are you asking them to do? How are you asking them to lead? Are there certain qualities or aspects of leadership that you care about? I remember we hired somebody in a pastoral role. This person has had a lot of ministry experience, and they had a very insightful question. We had all this stuff on a paper, and afterwards they said, "Now, Drew, tell me all the things that aren't on this paper that I'm still expected to know." And this person been around enough church to know that there's probably more just assumptions of how you operate, how you're supposed to relate to one another, that maybe aren't just your doctrinal statements or your macro level kind of love God, love others, love those who don't know Jesus type statements, but get into a bit more of whether it's work culture, whether it's how we're going to make decisions or navigate conflict, things like that. And the more clarity you can get, the more people you can invite into the vision. And that's why this is such a big deal. And I would say further, the more people feel empowered, because if you only have some huge vision, then you have somebody serving. How do they connect to that big vision? We're going to reach our city with the gospel and plant churches in the nations of the earth. That's awesome. I mean, that's my vision on the one hand. But if I don't add some more detail to that, how does a life group leader or a servant working with our kids ministry, like how do they see where they tie into that bigger vision? That gets a lot more complicated and complex. And so, I wish churches would spend time in all of these areas, more time. And that's one of my points of feedback for pastors consistently is you're just not as clear as you think you are. And, we're going to get into the next slide here, talking about how much clarity is needed. And, Charlie, something I've seen you do over the years is meet with church staff, and you'll just interview people, both on staff, not on staff, and you'll ask them the vision of the church. And I've always found that to be fascinating, getting a group of 20 people and seeing what they write down unprompted. I'd love to know what you found with that.
Yeah, well, I find that people normally don't have the capacity to define consistently what the vision and values are. Yes, they have little pieces of it, and maybe there is one slogan that everyone has memorized. But Drew, the question that you were asked by that pastor about, what's not said, I think that really, that's ultimately what we're talking about. What I'm talking about right here is you really need to define that, because most people are not mature enough or understand enough to even ask that question. And so that sort of is really what this next slide is about, is how much clarity is needed. And there are a variety of variables that kind of run through my mind. How complex and difficult is the vision? If it's just something really simple, then there's probably not a great need to write anything down. It's a one-off situation. Everybody understands it, and we can go accomplish it. But the more complex, the more difficult the vision, the more specificity and detail, desired outcomes, that all is helpful. What are the risks associated with failure? Obviously, the greater the risk, the greater the need for clarity. How mature is the ministry? If something has been going on for 10 years, then there's not as much clarity needed as something that we're just starting. I'm working with an individual right now, and they have two of those ministries. One is established, one is brand new. And he doesn't have to worry about clarity much in the older ministry, but the brand new one, he's having to kind of go back and really start over. So that's a reason for having more clarity. How many new servants are involved? If it's a brand new group of individuals, you might have to go really slow and really have a lot of clarity in order to onboard people well. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to apprenticing. Ultimately, what do the leaders need? Drew, any comments you want to add on any of those?
I think it's something I've run into in ministry is if I find myself frustrated with how something is going. So, pick a ministry in a church, kids ministry, youth ministry, whatever the case may be. My first question needs to be, was I clear with that ministry about what my expectations were? And I'll just say the vast majority of the time, really my frustration, if I'm being honest, is my own inattentiveness to the clarity that ministry needed to know what they were supposed to do. So I'll pick on youth ministry for a second. You think of all the things you have to juggle in a youth ministry. It is the relationship between the church and the parents in the church. It's the kids that grew up in the church that need to be discipled. And it's the kids who don't know Jesus that you're trying to reach. So you could bring a youth pastor in that really intuitively is passionate about reaching kids that are far from God. But this youth pastor may have no idea the importance of them also being able to pastor and walk with the parents of the youth as an example. And so, if you find that they're not doing a good job at that, then you have to ask the question, do we ever tell them that was a critical part of their job? And if not, then, you really have to look back at your own processes of where did we drop the ball here? And you can't just put that on your youth pastor. You have to say, that's our responsibility. We needed to get clear about what these key components were and be able to line that out to them. And, you could drill in even deeper. What level of availability are you expecting a pastoral staff member to have to the congregation? How responsive do they need to be? Some people think that they can respond to somebody who reaches out 2 weeks later. Other people feel like they need to be on call 24/7, and we could just go down list after list after list of things where clarity is needed. And, and I find, so as I look at all of this, I find where I get frustrated often, if I really consider it, I discover that those are opportunities where actually I need to be able to provide more clarity. And that's been a little helpful thing for me over the years, is to take my frustration and use that to drive to clarity. Yeah. So in answer to the question, how much clarity is needed? Bottom line, only as much as you need. And, if you go too far, too much clarity, you can get into needless perfectionism and you can spend all your time wordsmithing. I will say that has not been my typical experience in churches, but I could see how it could be. I think most churches I work with provide too little clarity. And so we have this big vision and we're urgent and we got to, we need leaders and we got to pull in people to serve. And, so we have this very big, compelling vision that's asking for people's involvement, but we haven't taken the time to give them clarity on what their involvement looks like. And that's just a setup for people getting hurt or burning out or whatever the thing may be. And I know that's never anybody's intention starting out, but there really is a cost associated with our lack of clarity. And, so I think that's a great, how do you answer this question? I think this is a great plumb line of, are you actually giving people enough clarity for them to grow, to develop, for you to be able to make wise decisions on who you pull into the vision, where there is a sense of alignment and agreement across your team. And this is one of those I think you'll notice when you don't have it.
Yeah. So Drew, I think that just one more comment I would have in regards to clarity is that some of the challenges of clarity is that I need to provide clarity for the people below us. And that's generally what we're talking about today. But there are times when I need to get clarity from the person above me. And so clarity is kind of a two-way street. And again, most of what we're talking about in this context is how we can equip people well who serve under us. But there are times when we have to press the people above us to get the clarity that we need in order to even serve the people that we're serving. So it can get complicated when you're in the middle of an organization and there are issues of clarity both above and below us.
Yeah, for those of you who end up becoming lead pastors or leading a team someday, I believe that there is a principle of you reap what you sow. And so what I would encourage you to do is, where you are not receiving the clarity that you need, be a proactive, helpful support to the person leading that team, and not a grumbler, but going to them and saying, as I've looked at my role, I've realized there's a lot of different directions it could go. And I put some thought into this. And what I would love to do is ask you some questions so that I can draw out of you, whoever your leader is, draw out of you what you need from me. And that's, I've had people do this for me. So it's funny is, I'm teaching this, but then when I'm in a team leader role, I'm still surprised how often I don't provide enough clarity. And I can just tell you, when somebody comes to me and they put a lot of thought into it and they're asking me thoughtful questions to say, Drew, as the leader of this team, what do you need from me? And they've analyzed it maybe in a way that I can't see. That's so helpful for me as a team leader. And I feel so supported when somebody does that. And, if somebody just tells me I'm not getting what I need and they don't give me any more than that, it probably is true. I'm probably not giving them what they need. But there's not as much I can do with that. And so as a team leader, I want to always be thinking this way. But as a team member, I want to be a positive help and a support. And I found the best way to do that is good questions and really asking questions for what's needed. And questions like, asking your team leader, what are your most important responsibilities, do you think? And really getting clear on what they're called to do and then drilling into what you need to do. And so this is my encouragement to those of you now, when you're maybe under somebody else's leadership, model this well, handle this well on your end. And I think there's something spiritually that takes place, but it's also going to be a real support for your team if you'll navigate that well. Well, as we wrap up this lesson, what you're going to discover as you continue to journey with us is how important clarity is for everything else. And these principles that we're going to roll out, they build on one another. And so the next ones we're going to talk about with Anointed Fit directly tie into the clarity of what you're actually trying to do. And then you get into apprenticing, coaching, all of these stem from clarity. So I just can't emphasize enough how important this lesson is of providing clarity, really drilling in. And I'll end with this thought. I know for all of us in ministry, there's this thing where it's ultimately it's God, it's people, it's the words God's spoken over us. That's what gets you out of bed. And that should always be what gets you out of bed. But if we don't take the time to just drill in a little deeper, ask the questions, then I think what you're going to discover is if you haven't gone there, if you haven't disciplined yourself to get clarity, there's ultimately going to be a liability towards how this vision gets rolled out in your church. And I know in ministry for me, sometimes it's like, man, the work it would take to get clear just can feel daunting, because it's probably not an issue of I don't know how to do it or our team is incapable of doing it. It's really an issue of we're rushing, we just haven't spent the time and dialogue together. And I find doing this well, for me, it takes a lot of listening. It takes a lot of back and forth, typically takes some all-day retreats. It's costly from a time standpoint. And so I think sometimes we think there's this big vision, let's just get to it. We don't need to spend our time wordsmithing or going through these documents. But I would challenge, I don't know that you can afford not to do this. And I think we can sacrifice the future for the sake of getting onto something with the present, rather than just building a little slower and getting clear up front, which then enables you to run much faster and multiply much further if we'll invest in this. And that, going back to the example of Jesus, that's what I see in his ministry, was slowing down with the disciples to get them really clear. So then we can see the explosion of the church at Pentecost and throughout the book of Acts.